we've seen how to do a sum of the parts analysis, but what does it mean for us corporate strategists? Just to recap, in our sum of the parts analysis, we concluded that the equity value per share was 10, whereas the price for which the share was currently trading was only 9. If you're a financial analyst, let's say you're working for Barclays, which is actually right over there, you can look at these calculations as follows. You can say, well, actually the share price is cheap. We calculated that it should be worth 10, but the actual price is only 9. So in other words, you could say the share is undervalued. Now, if through our calculations we conclude that the share is very undervalued, you might be willing to trade on that. You could say, I'm going to buy the share with the expectation or hope that the share price will go up in the future. But what about us, corporate strategies? What can we learn? Can we learn anything about corporate advantage? Here is the fundamentals of the sum of the parts. We calculated an enterprise value. For each business of our multi-business firm, we used multiples of single business peers. That is enterprise value over earnings multiples. Then we took the actual earnings of our own business and multiplied these to get enterprise value. We repeated these steps for each of our businesses. The sum of the businesses, that is, the sum of the parts, then gives an enterprise value for the entire multi-business firm. The formula shows a brief summary of this approach. It comes down to a multiplication between our actual earnings of the multi-business firm and multiples of single business peers. Corporate advantage is when businesses owned together are worth more than the businesses owned separately. Thus, we could say that corporate advantage compares the businesses when part of a multi-business firm versus when they are single businesses instead. This seems closely related to the comparison of a sum of the parts analysis. Can a sum of the parts analysis tell us something about corporate advantage? No and yes. No, because earnings are taken as fixed. It's the actual earnings of the businesses when owned jointly. We take that as an input to our calculations. From the calculations, we can never infer what earnings would be like if owned separately. Thus, a sum of the parts analysis cannot tell us what our businesses would be worth if owned separately. However, a sum of the parts analysis can tell you whether the market values a given level of earnings differently for your multi-business firm than for comparable single business firms. Let me explain. If we find that the sum of the parts is higher than the share price, it basically means that the multiple for which the single business peers are trading is higher than the multiple for which you are trading. This implies that the market values a $1 earning of your single business peers more than a $1 earning of your multi-business firm. One reason for this difference could be that the market does not understand your corporate strategy, and in particular, how you would create value across your different businesses. In summary, a sum of the parts can provide insight on the multiple, but not on the earnings. Thus, a sum of the parts analysis cannot tell us whether we have corporate advantage. However, it can give us an indication of how well the market values our earnings. And in effect, that means how well the market appreciates and understands our corporate strategy. We have seen the foundations of corporate strategy. Next, I'd like to discuss a tool that is commonly used within corporate strategy, a sum of the parts analysis. This is a quantitative technique that people use to value multi-business firms. Why is this technique important to you? A sum of the parts analysis can become a tool of power. Have you ever been in a meeting that was about the discussion of a complicated spreadsheet that you didn't fully understand? Now, what did you do in that situation? If you're like many of us, chances are that you didn't do anything. You may have kept quiet. And that is such a pity, because not only is your opinion lost, it might be that you are the expert in the business or businesses that are being discussed. Thus, I want you to be ready. The goal is not for you to become an expert in this technique. Rather, I want you to understand the method, be able to do some of the basic calculations yourself, and most importantly, participate in that discussion. The way we're going to make progress is we start by valuing a single business and then move to valuing multiple businesses. We're going to value a single business, and let's say that business is a shipbuilding business. Because we're going to value business number 4, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the information of other shipbuilding businesses, number 1, 2, and 3, to come up with some data that we can use for shipbuilding business number 4. The second column that you see is enterprise value. That basically means how much is the company worth. So if you were to buy that company or that business, how much would you have to pay? So for business 1, that would be 120. The third column is earnings, which is what were the earnings in the last year. And for this particular company number 1, it was 20. Given that we have information on enterprise value and on earnings, we can calculate what is called a multiple. In particular, we can calculate a multiple of enterprise value over earnings. Let's do the calculation and then let's think about what it is. So it's a ratio, which means that we need to divide 120 by 20, which is 6. What does this multiple represent? Well, it basically means if you want to buy business 1, you have to pay 6 times last year's earnings. We can calculate the same multiple for the other businesses. So if we want to calculate the multiple for business 2, we do 70 divided by 10 equals 7. Likewise, for business 3, we divide 120 by 15 equals 8. Now the next step is, given these 3 multiples, we're going to calculate the average across these 3 multiples. And it turns out the average of 6, 7, and 8 is 7. Now we've come up with an average price for the other businesses. Basically, we know on average a shipbuilding business is worth about 7 times its last year earnings. So in order to value shipbuilding business number 4, we're going to use that average and then calculate the enterprise value. So the next step for us is to use that average multiple. So we take this number and then do the opposite calculation. We have the multiple, we have the earnings, so we should be able to calculate enterprise value. And the way to do that is we're going to multiply the multiple times the earnings, because then earnings falls out and you're left with enterprise value. So 15 times 7 is 105. Just to recap, we're using the average value of the other businesses, 1, 2, and 3, to calculate an enterprise value for number 4. We have more confidence in our valuation if businesses 1, 2, and 3 are more similar to business 4. We have less confidence in our valuation if businesses 1, 2, and 3 are more different than number 4. We've just valued a single business. Now let's move to the case of valuing a multi-business firm. And let's say our multi-business firm has 3 businesses: shipbuilding, home building, and trucking. The basic idea is that what we did for shipbuilding, that is comparing it with other shipbuilding businesses, we're going to do exactly the same for home building and for trucking. For home building, we will be comparing that business with other home building businesses, and for trucking, we will be comparing that with other trucking businesses. So let's recap. In shipbuilding, we had calculated a multiple of 7 using the 3 other shipbuilding businesses. Now, using that multiple, we could calculate a value for the shipbuilding business. And the way we did that was we multiplied 7 times 15, giving us an enterprise value for just that shipbuilding business of 105. Now we're going to apply the exact same technique for home building. And let's say our comparison with other home building businesses yielded an average multiple of 11. And just to recap, that meant that on average, the home building businesses are worth roughly 11 times last year's earning. If we multiply that multiple of 11 times 10, we can derive the enterprise value for just home building. So 10 times 11 is giving us 110. As the next step, we're going to replicate the exact same procedure for trucking. We compare other trucking businesses and we find that there the average multiple is 8. Again, that means on average, a trucking business is worth 8 times last year's earning. So if we multiply 8 times 20, we can infer a value of our trucking business using the value of other trucking businesses. Now we've come up with a value for each business separately. 105 for shipbuilding, 110 for home building, 160 for trucking. Now we want to calculate the value of the entire multi-business firm. There's only one step remaining, and that is we need to include or incorporate headquarters. There's basically two ways of doing that. Either you can subtract the cost of headquarters directly from the earnings of the individual businesses. That is, you would allocate some cost to shipbuilding, allocate some cost to home building, and allocate yet the remaining part to trucking, which lead to lower earnings for each of these businesses. Or you could do, as is done here, include it at the very end. Either way is fine, but what's important to remember is if you do it at the end, we're talking about the ongoing cost of corporate headquarters. It's not necessarily, or it's not last year's earnings only. Now we have all pieces in place and we can calculate the enterprise value for our multi-business firm. The way to do that is we're going to add everything in this column of enterprise value, and we need to keep into account that headquarters has a minus. So we subtract that from the whole. So if we add all these numbers, 105, that gives us 365. So now, based on our sum of the parts analysis, we've concluded that our multi-business firm is worth 365. Actual sum of the parts are slightly more complicated, but not by a lot. And in fact, the underlying logic is the same. So I hope you can now follow a sum of the parts analysis. Let's just recap what we have done. For each business of the multi-business firm, we're going to look for a group of focus peers. That means a group of single business firms that are comparable to the business that we want to value. Using that group of focus peers, we're going to calculate an average multiple. We use that multiple of those other single business firms to calculate the business or the value of our business. And we're going to do that as often as the number of businesses that we have in the multi-business firm. Once we have valued each business of our multi-business firm, we're going to add all values of these businesses, which gives us a value for the multi-business firm. The one thing that we need to keep in mind as a last step, we need to include or subtract the cost of corporate headquarters. We can either do that in step 1 or as the very last step as a step 3. This is the basic mechanism of a sum of the parts analysis. From the sum of the parts analysis, we concluded that the enterprise value was 365. Now we can think of that enterprise value consisting of two parts, and those parts correspond to the way a firm is typically financed: debt and equity, or shareholders and bondholders. So one part of the firm or the enterprise belongs to the bondholders, the other part belongs to the shareholders. The part that belongs to the bondholders we refer to as debt or net debt. The remaining part that belongs to the shareholders, we refer to that as equity. Now we're interested in calculating the equity value. So if we know the enterprise value, which is the total circle, and we know the portion of net debt, then we can subtract one from another, giving us the equity value. So what we're going to do is we take the 365s minus the 165, giving us an equity value of 200. Now what we've done is we went from the value of the entire enterprise to the value of the equity, that is the value for the shareholders. If we want to calculate the value per share, all that we need to do is divide by the number of shares. Here the number of shares is very low, 20. But imagine that this actually represents 20 million and the equity value that we have been calculating is also in millions. Then we can say the equity value per share is simply the equity value divided by the number of shares, which is the 200 divided by the 20, giving us an equity value per share of 10. Now this is how much we think the share should be worth based on our sum of the parts analysis. As the last step, we can compare our calculations with how much the share is actually trading for. In our sum of the parts analysis, we calculated an equity value per share of 10. We can compare that number with the price for which the share is actually trading. Let's say that share is trading currently at 9, which means that our calculations are higher than the share price. Thus, our sum of the parts analysis yielded a price that was actually higher than the price that the share is currently trading for. And actually, that is a common finding across many sum of the parts analysis of multi-business firms. Now, what does that mean? Let's go to the next video to find out.
Welcome back to Corporate Strategy. Last week we talked about one of the key decisions in corporate strategy being which business should you enter. Now this week we're going to pick up on that discussion and talk about diversification, which is entering a new business. When you think about diversification, there's really three types of questions that you should be asking yourself. First is whether you should diversify, that is, whether you should even enter a new business. The second is which business should you enter? There's so many businesses out there, which business is the right one for you? And lastly, how can you even enter a new business? What are some of the options that you have available that you can choose from? What we're going to do in this week is really thinking about these three questions, and we're going to use a structured approach. It's a series of steps that you can use and then apply in your setting. Now, let's begin our discussion of diversification with some examples. The first example is the Finnish Post. Like many national post carriers, their main business is delivering the post to your homes. Now, the Finnish Post recently has decided to diversify into a new business. They now offer also to mow your lawn. So they not only deliver your mail, they also can mow the lawn for you. And the reason they can offer that is they do that on quiet days, when the volume of the post is limited. They have spare time, and the person delivering your mail can then also mow your lawn. The next example is Moxy, which is a new hotel chain. And do you know who's behind this? Well, you might be surprised to learn that one of the founders of this hotel chain is IKEA. Of course, we all know IKEA from its furniture that you need to self-assemble, but they also have a real estate business. They typically rent out office space to companies. But now they've decided we want to use our real estate business and enter the hotel business. And what's interesting is that they teamed up with Marriott, which is one of the largest hotel operators in the world. The last example is Fosun, a Chinese company. Originally it started off as an insurance company, but they have since diversified into many different businesses. So they now offer also financing for leasing a car. They're into the entertainment business. They're even into the tourism business. They recently bought a company, ROC Oil, which is an Australian company, which took Fosun into the oil business. Now, what's interesting with this example, but with many other diversification examples that you see, is that oftentimes they're quite exotic. The diversification move oftentimes takes a company into very different businesses than they originally were in. These were 3 examples of diversification. So diversification is entering a new business. Here's a systematic representation of diversification. Let's say your company is active in footballs. So you produce footballs, and then one day you decide to enter a new business. And let's say that business is the footwear business. Before you were not active in footwears, after you are active in footwear. And that is called diversification, entering a new business. New means here new to you, not necessarily new to the world. Because when you enter the footwear business, it's very likely that there's already producers of footwears present. So diversification and entering a new business, new for you. Thus, diversification is entering a new business. Now, from last week, we saw that we could describe a business in terms of the who, what, how. Now, entering a new business thus means whenever you change the who, or the what, or the how. The examples I picked here were mostly changes in the what, but diversification also is entering a new business by changing the who or the how. Now, in the next slide, we're going to look at how you can enter a new business. So what are some of the options that you have available to pursue your diversification? In the last video, we saw some examples of what diversification is. But how can firms diversify? What options do you have available if you want to diversify? The firms in our previous examples go about diversification quite differently. If you think back to our example of the Finnish Post, they entered the lawn mowing business on their own. They did that without the help of anyone else. We call that organic growth. The second example we looked at was Moxie, a partnership between IKEA on the one hand and Marriott on the other hand. That partnership we call an alliance. The last example was Fosun entering the oil business. As you saw, they also teamed up with someone else, which was the Australian company called ROC Oil. Now, it wasn't just an alliance, Fosun actually bought ROC Oil. We call that an acquisition, or oftentimes referred to as an M&A. M&A stands for mergers and acquisitions, but we don't really care so much about the difference between a merger and an acquisition. So I'll be talking about an M&A or an acquisition interchangeably. If you're considering diversification, then we can describe the main choices that you have using something called a growth tree. Let's walk through the 3 step by step. So at the top you see entering new business, which is the diversification decision. At the first tree, or at the first branch, the choice is between, on the one hand, inorganic growth, and on the other hand, organic growth. That simply means, do you do it on your own, organic growth, or do you team up with someone else, inorganic growth? Within inorganic growth, you have the choice between an acquisition, so-called M&A, or alliances. What you see is that there's actually a further distinction within alliances, and it's something called non-equity versus equity alliances. Let's look in detail what that is. Here's a continuum of relationship between firms. On the one hand, you have what is called an arm's length relationship, which entails very little interactions between 2 firms. On the other side of the spectrum, you have an M&A, which entails a lot of interaction between 2 firms. As we move from the left, arm's length, towards the right, M&A, 2 things happen. The first thing is that the intensity of collaboration between firms increases. So let me just add that here. The intensity of collaboration goes up as we move from the left to the right. The other thing that happens is that the level of equity of one partner in another increases. The level of equity goes up as we go from an arm's length relationship to an M&A relationship. Now, equity simply means ownership. So at the left-hand side, there's no ownership. On the right-hand side, one company actually owns another company. Now, what does ownership do? Basically, it does three things. First, it aligns incentives between partners. Second, it facilitates coordination. And lastly, it enables information flows. In the middle, between arm's length and M&A, you have a category called alliances. These are relationships between firms that cannot be managed by a contract alone. A close working relationship is needed. It's different from an M&A in the sense that the partners remain independent, whereas in an M&A, one partner owns the other partner. Alliances are also different from arm's length relationship in the sense that there's more collaboration ongoing. Let's look in a bit more detail at these different categories to really understand the differences between them. So let's begin with the non-equity alliance. Non-equity means no partner has an ownership stake in the other. What I'm showing you here is actually 4 examples all entered into by Fosun. So it turns out that Fosun has a non-equity alliance with Daimler to help finance leasing contracts for the customers. So basically they formed an alliance. So Fosun formed an alliance with Daimler, which is a producer of cars. There's intense collaboration, but there's no equity. That means Fosun does not have a stake in Daimler. Fosun also has an alliance with Cirque du Soleil. Now, the difference with this one is that it's an equity alliance, meaning that Fosun has a stake, an ownership stake in Cirque du Soleil. The third example is Thomas Cook, which is a company active in the tourism industry. Fosun and Thomas Cook formed a joint venture. This is actually an instance of an equity alliance, but it has a specific structure. Now, the first thing to note is that a joint venture really means it's a new venture. So Thomas Cook and Fosun started a new company, and it's joint in the sense that both companies are owners of that new company. So Fosun is one owner, Thomas Cook is the other owner in that new company. Now, oftentimes with joint ventures, the split is 50-50. I own 50% of the new venture, you own the other 50%, but that's not a given. We can vary our ownership stake. The last category is called M&A, and here the difference is that one company owns the other company. So one company has full ownership of the other company. Fosun bought ROC Oil. That means Fosun is the owner of ROC Oil. So we've seen the options of how to diversify. At the very top of the growth tree, we have the choice between inorganic and organic. Within inorganic, we have the choice between M&A and alliances. And then as the last step, within alliances, you have equity versus non-equity alliances. In the next video, we'll look at when to diversify.